The history of the North is written in blood, but some chapters are written in silence. There are sagas that the skalds do not sing in the great halls, stories that are whispered only when the mead is gone and the fire has turned to dying embers. They speak of places where the maps end. They speak of islands where the sea does not crash against the shore, but laps quietly like oil in a bucket. They speak of kings who did not go to Valhalla, but stayed behind, guarding treasures that glitter with a light not of this world. And it is the story of Jarl Einar, a man whose greed was vast enough to swallow the ocean, and the 40 souls he led into the dark. Einar was not a wicked man by nature, but he was a hungry one. He was the son of a great raider, a man who had built Kattegat's walls with Frankish gold. Einar had spent his life in his father's shadow, desperate to prove that he was not just a son, but a wolf in his own right. He had raided the west, he had traded in the east, but the hunger remained. It gnawed at his gut. It kept him awake at night while his wife slept soundly beside him. He wanted a legacy. He wanted a hoard so large that poets would sing of it for 1,000 years. And it was this hunger that led him to the dusty scrolls of the blind wanderer who had died in his hall the previous winter. The scrolls spoke of the island of Ash. It spoke of King Hrolf the Cruel, a tyrant from the age of legends who had united the northern tribes with sorcery and steel. Legend said that Hrolf had discovered a vein of gold so pure that it was said to be the blood of the earth itself. When Hrolf sensed his death approaching, he did not distribute his wealth to his sons. He did not give it to his people. He killed the miners who found it. He killed the smiths who forged it. And finally, he ordered his most loyal warriors to carry it to a desolate island, buried deep within a volcanic mound. Then he had those warriors killed, their bodies laid in a circle around his throne to serve him in the darkness. The scroll ended with a warning, written in a dialect so old Einar barely understood it. The gold is not the treasure, the gold is the bait. Do not wake the sleeper. Einar laughed when he read it. He saw only the word gold. He did not see the word bait. Preparations began in secret. Einar knew that if the other Jarls heard of his destination, they would either try to stop him out of superstition or try to beat him to the prize. He handpicked his crew. He did not choose the young, glory-hungry boys who dreamed of Valkyries. He chose the veterans, men with gray in their beards and scars on their soul, men who had seen enough death to stop fearing it. He chose Arn the Bear, a berserker who could snap a man's spine with one hand. He chose Leif the Silent, an archer who never missed. He chose 40 men who loved gold more than they loved the gods, but he needed one more man, a man who was not a warrior. He needed Thorstein. Thorstein was the oldest navigator in the fjord. His skin was like tanned leather, his eyes the color of a stormy sea. He lived alone in a hut on the edge of the village, spending his days watching the tides and casting runestones. When Einar came to him, Thorstein was already packing a bag. "Oh, you know why I am here," Einar said, standing in the doorway of the smoky hut. "I saw the signs," the old man rasped. "The ravens have been silent for 3 days. The tide is pulling the wrong way. Something has shifted in the deep. You are going to the island of Ash." "I need your eyes, Thorstein," Einar said. "The maps stop at the frozen belt. No one knows the currents beyond the gray reef except you. Guide me there, and I will give you a weight of gold equal to your own body." Thorstein stopped packing. He looked at the Jarl with eyes filled with a profound, weary sadness. "I do not want your gold, Einar. Gold is heavy. It drags a man down to the bottom of the sea." "Then why are you packing?" Einar asked. "Because if I do not go, you will all die before you even see the island," Thorstein said. "And there is a boy on your crew, Bjorn, my sister's son. He is young and foolish, and he worships you. I go to bring him back, not you." Einar smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "I do not care why you come, old man. Just get me to the island." They set sail at dawn. The dragon ship, named the Sea Wolf, cut through the water of the fjord. The villagers cheered from the docks, unaware of where the ship was heading. They thought Einar was going to raid the Saxons again. Only the crew knew the truth. And as the familiar mountains of home faded into the mist behind them, a heavy silence settled over the deck. This was not a raiding party. It felt like a funeral procession. For the first week, the sea was kind. The wind filled the red and white striped sail, pushing them northwest, far beyond the shipping lanes of the traders. But on the 8th day, the world began to change. The water, usually a deep, vibrant blue, turned a dull, sickly gray. It became thick, almost oily. When the oars dipped into it, they didn't splash, they sliced through sludge. The air grew cold, a damp, penetrating chill that no amount of fur could keep out. And then the fog arrived. It was not the clean white mist of the mountain. It was a yellow, sulphurous fog that tasted of rotten eggs and copper. It clung to the ship, dampening sound. A man could shout from the prow, and the man at the rudder would barely hear a whisper. Thorstein stood at the helm, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering oar. His eyes were closed. He was navigating not by sight, for there was nothing to see, but by the feel of the currents vibrating through the wood of the ship. Turn east. Thorstein would suddenly shout, "Rocks!" The crew would scramble, pulling the oars frantically, and sure enough, jagged black stones would appear out of the fog, inches from the hull, like the teeth of a submerged leviathan waiting to bite. These were warriors who would charge a shield wall without blinking. But this silence was unnerving. There were no seagulls, no seals, no whales breaching. The ocean was dead here. Mayprine, the ocean was dead here. "This place is wrong, Jarl," he grumbled to Einar. "The water, it looks like it's waiting." Einar stood tall at the prow, staring into the yellow gloom. "Keep rowing," he commanded. "The dead do not wait, they sleep, and we are coming to wake them up." On the 12th day, the fog began to thin, revealing a sight that made the blood run cold in their veins. Ahead of them, rising from the flat gray sea, was the island of Ash. It was an ugly place, a jagged scar of black volcanic rock jutting out of the ocean. There was no green, no trees, no grass, no moss. The ground was covered in a thick layer of gray ash, spewed from some ancient eruption, which swirled in the windless air like restless ghosts. And in the center of the island, dominating the landscape, was the Great Mound. It was not a natural hill. It was a massive, artificial pyramid of piled stones, black and imposing. It sat there like a dark idol, watching them approach. "Row!" Einar shouted, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of greed and madness. "We are here, the kingdom of Hrolf." The ship's keel scraped against the black sand of the beach. The sound was harsh, tearing through the unnatural silence. The men jumped out, splashing into the icy water to drag the ship ashore. The water felt slimy against their skin. Thorstein remained on the boat for a moment, looking up at the Great Mound. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small iron amulet, a hammer of Thor. He kissed it, whispering a prayer that was lost in the dead air. Then he climbed down. The island smelled of sulfur and old dust. As they walked up the beach, their boots kicked up clouds of ash that lingered in the air. Einar led the way, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The 40 men followed, torches unlit, weapons drawn. They marched toward the mound. The silence was absolute. No wind howled through the rocks. No insects buzzed. It was as if the island itself was holding its breath. They reached the base of the Great Mound. It was colossal, easily 100 feet high, built from thousands of heavy black stones. At its base stood a massive slab of granite, sealing the entrance. The slab was carved with runes that glowed faintly with a dull, red light. Einar approached the slab. He ran his hand over the rough stone. "Read it," he ordered Thorstein. Thorstein stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he deciphered the ancient script. His face went pale. It says, "Here lies the king of the long night. Here lies the hunger that does not fade. Turn back, living men, for the gold you seek is the price of your soul." Einar laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed too loudly. "Soul? What use is a soul if you are poor? We are Vikings, Thorstein. We take what we want." He turned to his men. "Break it open." Arn and 3 other strong men stepped forward with heavy iron pickaxes. They raised them high and brought them down on the granite seal. Clang! The sound rang out like a bell. Sparks flew, but the stone did not crack. Again, Einar roared. Clang! For an hour, they struck the stone. Sweat poured down their faces, turning the ash on their skin into gray mud. They grunted and cursed, their muscles burning. The stone seemed to absorb the blows, mocking them. "Oh," the young nephew of Thorstein said. He stepped forward with a heavy sledgehammer. He was young, eager to prove himself to the Jarl. He spat on his hands, swung the hammer in a wide arc, and struck the very center of the runes. Crack! A hairline fracture appeared in the granite. A hiss of air escaped from the crack, a sound like a serpent waking up. "Keep hitting it." Einar shouted, seeing the progress. "Don't stop!" The men redoubled their efforts. The crack widened. Spiderwebs of fractures spread across the seal. And then, with a final, thunderous crumble, the upper half of the granite slab collapsed inward. A blast of air rushed out of the tomb. It was not the stale, musty air of a normal grave. It was freezing cold. It hit the men like a physical blow, knocking the breath from their lungs. It smelled of dried spices, preserved meat, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like fresh blood. Einar stood before the gaping black hole of the entrance. The darkness inside seemed to swirl, thick and impenetrable. "Light the torches," Einar whispered. The men struck their flints. One by one, 40 torches flared to life, casting flickering orange light against the black stones. The fire seemed smaller here, as if the darkness was trying to smother it. "I will go first," Einar said. "If there are traps, I will trigger them. If there are ghosts, I will kill them." He stepped into the tomb. The tunnel was wide, lined with pillars carved from the bones of whales. The floor was smooth obsidian. The footsteps of 40 men echoed loudly, a chaotic rhythm in the dark. Thorstein walked beside Bjorn, his hand gripping the boy's shoulder. "Stay close to me," he whispered. "Touch nothing. Do not look at the shadows. Look only at the light." "Why, uncle?" Bjorn whispered back, his voice trembling with excitement. "It's just a cave." "Because in places like this," Thorstein murmured, "the shadows look back." They walked for what felt like miles. The tunnel sloped downward, taking them deep beneath the earth, below the level of the sea. The temperature dropped further. Frost began to form on their beards. And then the tunnel opened up. They stepped into a cavern so vast that the light of their torches could not reach the ceiling. And in the center of the cavern, illuminated by the combined glow of 40 flames, lay the treasure of King Hrolf. The men gasped. It was a mountain of gold. There were chests that had burst open, spilling rivers of silver coins across the floor. There were statues of gods made of solid jade. There were swords with hilts encrusted with rubies the size of apples. There were golden shields, helmets, armbands, necklaces. It glittered and sparkled, a chaotic ocean of wealth. It was enough to buy a kingdom. It was enough to build a fleet of 1,000 ships. "We are rich," one of the warriors shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "By Odin's beard, we are kings." The discipline broke. The men rushed forward. They dropped their weapons. They fell to their knees in the gold, laughing, crying, scooping up handfuls of coins and letting them rain down over their heads. They stuffed their pouches, their boots, their tunics. Einar stood still. He did not look at the loose gold. His eyes were fixed on the center of the chamber. There, rising from the pile of treasure like an island in a golden sea, was a dais of black stone, and on the dais sat a throne. And on the throne sat King Hrolf. He was massive. Even sitting down, he towered over them. He wore armor of black plate, etched with runes of binding. A heavy cloak of preserved bear fur hung from his broad shoulders. On his head was a crown of iron spikes. But it was his face that froze Einar's blood. He was not a skeleton. He was not dust. He was preserved. His skin was a pale, icy blue, stretched tight over his muscles. His lips were pulled back in a permanent, dry snarl, revealing teeth filed to sharp points. His beard was braided with silver wire. He sat motionless, his massive hands resting on the pommel of a greatsword that stood between his knees. The sword was rusted, pitted with age, but the edge still looked razor, sharp. "He is perfectly preserved," Thorstein whispered, stepping up beside Einar. The salt in the air, the cold, it kept him from rotting. "Or perhaps he chose not to rot," Einar said, his voice low. Einar walked up the steps of the dais. The crunch of his boots on the gold coin sounded deafeningly loud. He stopped 5 feet from the throne. He looked into the closed, sunken eyelids of the dead king. "Your watch is over, King Hrolf," Einar said, his voice echoing in the cavern. "Your gold belongs to the living now." Einar reached out. He didn't want the coins. He wanted the crown, the iron crown of the north. "Don't touch him, Einar." Einar ignored him. His hand inched closer to the iron crown. His fingertips brushed the cold metal. Hum! A low, vibrating sound filled the chamber. It felt like the bass string of a giant harp had been plucked. The dust on the floor jumped. The gold coins rattled against each other. The men stopped laughing. They looked around, wide-eyed. "What was that?" Arne asked, gripping his axe. The sound came again. Hum! Louder this time. It vibrated in their teeth. It resonated in their chests. Einar pulled his hand back. He looked at the face of the dead king. The eyelids of the corpse snapped open. The eyes of King Hrolf were not white with cataracts or yellow with decay. They were vivid, piercing pools of electric blue fire. They glowed with an intensity that cut through the torchlight, illuminating the terrified faces of the men standing frozen in the gold. It was not the blank stare of a mindless corpse. It was the focused, hateful glare of a predator that had been waiting for centuries. Einar stumbled back, his boots slipping on the coins. He drew his sword, the sound of steel ringing sharp in the silence. The king's chest, covered in rusted black plate, did not rise or fall. He did not breathe, but he moved. Slowly, with the grinding sound of bone scraping against stone, Hrolf turned his head. He looked at Einar. Then he looked at the hand that had dared to touch his crown. The king opened his mouth. Dust poured out like smoke. His jaw unhinged slightly, revealing rows of teeth that had been filed into jagged points and inlaid with gold. Thieves. The word was not spoken. It vibrated inside their skulls. It was a psychic scream, a sound that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the brain. Several men dropped their torches, clutching their heads in agony, blood trickling from their noses. "Kill it!" Einar screamed, his voice cracking. "Cut him down. It's just a corpse. Arn the Bear, the massive berserker who feared no living man," roared a challenge. He charged up the steps of the dais. Raising his heavy double-headed axe, he swung with all his might, aiming for the king's neck. It was a blow that would have felled an ox. Clang! The axe struck the king's neck and shattered. The rusted armor did not dent. The pale blue skin did not cut. The axe head exploded into shrapnel, sending metal shards flying across the room. Hrolf did not flinch. He simply reached out. His movement was a blur, unnaturally fast for something so large. He caught Arn by the throat. Arn gagged, his feet lifting off the ground as the king raised him into the air with one hand. The berserker clawed at the cold, dead fingers, his face turning purple. Tilted his head, studying the struggling warrior like an insect. "Weak," Hrolf squeezed. There was a sickening, wet crunch. Arn's neck collapsed. His head flopped to the side at an impossible angle. The king tossed the massive body aside as if it were a rag doll. Arn landed in a pile of gold coins, twitching once, then still. Panic exploded in the chamber. The men screamed. The discipline of the shield wall vanished instantly. "He's a demon!" one warrior shouted. "Run!" 3 men turned and sprinted for the tunnel entrance. They scrambled over the gold, desperate to reach the darkness of the exit. He was 7 feet tall, a tower of ancient malice. He reached down and picked up the massive greatsword that lay at his feet. The blade was 6 feet long, dark, and pitted with rust. As his hand closed around the hilt, the runes on the blade flared with green witchfire. He swung the sword. He didn't even seem to aim. A wave of invisible force erupted from the blade. It flew across the room and struck the 3 fleeing men in the back. They were thrown forward violently, their bodies hitting the stone wall with bone-shattering force. They slid down, leaving streaks of blood on the obsidian. "No one leaves," the voice in their heads hissed. "My gold, my blood, my tomb." Einar stood his ground, though his legs were trembling. "Form up," he bellowed at his terrified crew. 40 against 1. Use the spears. Use the spears. The men, driven by the instinct of survival, rallied to their Jarl. They formed a loose circle around the dais, leveling their spears at the monster. "Attack," Einar commanded. 12 spears thrust forward at once, aiming for the gaps in the king's armor. The armpits, the groin, the neck. The spear tips struck home. They pierced the chainmail. They sank into the dead flesh. Hrolf looked down at the spears sticking out of his chest and legs. He didn't bleed. No blood flowed, only a thick, black ichor that smelled of tar. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound like rocks tumbling down a cliff. He grabbed 2 of the spear shafts. With a casual twist of his wrists, he snapped the ashwood like twigs. He swept his greatsword in a wide, low arc. The blade sheared through the legs of the front line. 4 men screamed as they fell, clutching their severed limbs. The room filled with a copper smell of fresh blood. The scent seemed to invigorate the Draugr. His blue eyes flared brighter. Thorstein, standing near the back with young Bjorn, saw the true horror. "Look at the shadows, Bjorn. Look at the walls." Bjorn looked. The shadows cast by the torches were stretching. They were detaching themselves from the walls. The pillars of bone were vibrating. "He is waking the others," Thorstein whispered in horror. "We are not fighting one, we are fighting the Legion." From the dark corners of the vast cavern, from the alcoves hidden in the gloom, shapes began to move, shuffling, dragging footsteps, the sound of rusted metal scraping on stone. Dead warriors stepped into the light. They were Hrolf's elite guard. They were withered husks, their skin dried to leather, their armor hanging loosely on their skeletal frames. Some were missing arms, some had no lower jaws, but all of them had the same burning blue eyes. They carried rusted axes, broken swords, and rotted shields. There were dozens of them. They blocked the exit. "We are trapped," Leif the Silent shouted, knocking an arrow. He fired. The arrow struck a Draugr in the eye socket. The creature didn't even slow down. It kept walking, pulling the arrow out and snapping it. Einar saw his dream of an empire turning into a slaughterhouse. He realized, with a cold clarity, that he would not leave this place a rich man. He might not leave at all. "Break through," Einar roared, pointing his sword at the tunnel entrance. "Forget the gold. Save your lives. Cut a path to the ship." The Vikings charged the line of the dead. It was a desperate, chaotic brawl. Living flesh against dead bone, Bjorn found himself face to face with a Draugr. The creature swung a rusted mace. Bjorn ducked, the weapon whistling over his head. He thrust his short sword into the creature's gut. It felt like stabbing a bag of sand. The Draugr grabbed Bjorn's shoulder, its grip like a vice. Bjorn screamed as the cold fingers dug into his flesh. "Uncle!" Thorstein appeared from the chaos. He didn't use a sword. He held up the iron hammer of Thor and shouted a prayer. He swung a heavy torch, smashing it into the Draugr's face. The fire clung to the dry, preserved skin. The creature recoiled, screeching, not in pain, but in aversion to the light. "Move, boy!" They were flammable. "Burn them," Einar ordered. Warriors threw their torches at the advancing wall of death. The dry, ancient bodies caught fire instantly. The cavern filled with the smell of burning meat and the unearthly shrieks of the burning dead. The line of Draugr broke, scattering in confusion. "Now, run." Einar led the charge. He hacked through the burning remains of a skeletal warrior, kicking the skull away. He reached the tunnel entrance. "Come on," he yelled back to his men. They scrambled into the tunnel, leaving the glittering mountain of gold behind, leaving the bodies of their fallen brothers. But King Hrolf did not run. He stood on his dais amidst the flames, watching them flee. He raised his greatsword high, close. The command shook the foundations of the island. As the men ran up the sloping tunnel, the ground began to shake. Dust rained from the ceiling. "The door," Thorstein shouted. "The seal is closing." Ahead of them, the light of the outside world was shrinking. The massive granite slabs they had broken were knitting themselves back together, sliding shut with the groan of tectonic plates. "Faster. Drop your armor. Drop everything." Men threw away their shields. They threw away their helmets. They ran until their hearts threatened to burst. Einar was the first to reach the closing gap. It was now only 3 feet wide. He dove through, tumbling out onto the ash-covered slope of the mound. Thorstein and Bjorn were close behind. They squeezed through. "Pull them out," Einar shouted, grabbing the arm of a warrior named Geir who was stuck halfway. The stone was closing like a giant mouth. Geir screamed as the rock pressed against his ribs. "Help me! Jarl! Help!" Einar pulled. Arni pulled. Einar pulled, but the stone was stronger. Crunch, the gap closed. Geir's scream was cut short. The seal was solid again. "We made it," one warrior sobbed, falling to his knees in the ash. "We made it out." Einar looked at the sealed tomb. He looked at his empty hands. He had lost 10 of his best men. He had lost the gold, and he had woken a nightmare. "To the ship," Einar said, his voice hollow. "We leave, now." They stumbled down the beach toward the sea wolf. They expected to push the ship into the water and sail away, putting miles of ocean between them and the curse. But when they reached the shoreline, they stopped. The sea was gone. While they were inside, the tide had gone out, but it was not a normal tide. The water had retreated hundreds of yards, leaving the ship stranded high and dry on a vast expanse of black mud and sharp rocks. "Push it!" Einar screamed, running to the hull. "Push it to the water!" 30 men put their shoulders to the wood. They grunted, they heaved, but the ship was heavy and the mud was like glue. It barely moved an inch. "It's no use," Thorstein said, looking at the horizon. "The tide won't come back for hours. Maybe not until dawn. We are stuck," Bjorn whispered. And then the sun began to set. It happened with terrifying speed. The gray sky turned purple, then black. The temperature plummeted, and from the sea the fog returned. It rolled over the mudflats, thick and yellow. It swallowed the horizon. It swallowed the ship. And from the fog they heard it. Thump, thump, heavy footsteps, iron boots on stone. They looked back at the Great Mound. The seal they had just seen close was open again, and standing at the top of the mound, silhouetted against the rising moon, was King Hrolf. He held his burning green sword, and behind him, pouring out of the tomb like a river of ants, were the others. Not just the elite guard, but the rest of the army, hundreds of them. They didn't run, they didn't scream. They simply began to walk down the hill. "Shield wall," Einar shouted, drawing his sword. "Form a circle around the ship. We hold them here." But Thorstein looked at the water. The sea was beginning to boil. "They aren't just coming from the hill, Jarl," Thorstein whispered. From the black mud of the seabed, hands were rising, pale, blue hands. The crew of Hrolf's ancient ships, drowned and bound to the island, were clawing their way out of the muck. They were surrounded, on land, and from the sea. The night of screams was about to begin. The sun vanished, swallowed by a horizon that seemed to have been erased from existence. The world shrank to the size of their stranded ship, a wooden island in a sea of black mud and swirling yellow fog. The temperature plummeted, freezing the breath in their lungs. And then the silence returned. But it was a heavy, pregnant silence, broken only by the wet, sucking sound of the mud and the rhythmic clank, clank, clank of rusted armor approaching through the mist. Einar stood on the deck of the sea, wolf, his sword drawn, his face pale but set in a mask of grim determination. Below him, on the mudflats, 20 of his men formed a tight shield wall around the hull, their spears bristling outward like the spines of a terrified hedgehog. The other 10, the wounded and the archers, remained on the deck with Thorstein and Bjorn, clutching their bows with trembling hands. "They are coming," Bjorn whispered, staring into the gloom. He could see shapes moving in the fog, shadows that were too tall, too stiff, too silent to be men. "Steady." Einar roared, his voice cutting through the fear. "They are just meat and bone. We have faced worse. We have faced Saxons. We have faced storms. We are the wolves of the sea." But deep down, Einar knew this was a lie. Saxons bled. Storms passed. This enemy did neither. The first attack did not come with a war cry. It came with a spear. A black, iron-tipped javelin flew out of the fog with impossible speed. It struck Hakon, a veteran shield bearer standing on the mud, squarely in the chest. The force of the blow was so great that it lifted him off his feet and pinned him to the hull of the ship. Hakon didn't even scream. He just gasped, blood bubbling from his lips, and died. Shields up. Einar screamed. Before the men could react, a second spear flew. Then a third. Then a dozen. They rained down on the ship, thudding into the wood, shattering shields, piercing flesh. 2 more men fell, clutching their throats. "Return fire." Leafs. The 10 archers on the ship drew their bows and fired blindly into the fog. The arrows disappeared into the yellow soup. They heard the thwack of arrows hitting something solid, wood, leather, perhaps bone. But there were no cries of pain, no curses, just the relentless marching footsteps. And then they emerged. The fog parted like a curtain, revealing the nightmare. The first wave of Draugr was not the elite guard from the tomb. These were the drowned, the crew of King Hrolf's ancient fleet, who had been sacrificed to the sea 3 centuries ago. They were bloated, waterlogged horrors, their skin gray and peeling, seaweed tangled in their rotted hair. Barnacles grew on their armor, crabs scuttled in the empty sockets of their eyes. They shambled forward, dragging rusted swords and driftwood clubs. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, but they were relentless. "Hold the line," Einar bellowed, jumping down from the deck to join his men in the mud. He knew that if the shield wall broke, they were all dead. The 2 lines clashed with a sound like a landslide. Living flesh met dead meat. The Vikings fought with the desperation of trapped animals. Axes cleaved through rotted skulls. Swords severed waterlogged limbs. Einar was a whirlwind of steel, hacking off arms, kicking bodies back into the mud. He fought with a savage grace, fueled by terror and adrenaline. "Die," he screamed, burying his sword in the chest of a drowned sailor. "Why won't you die?" The creature, impaled on his blade, simply looked at him with empty, milky eyes. It reached out with a gnarled hand and grabbed Einar's throat. Its grip was freezing cold and unbelievably strong. Einar gagged, struggling to pull his sword free. Behind him, Arn the bear, or what was left of him, stepped out of the fog. No, Einar gasped, who had died in the tomb just hours ago, was walking. His neck was still broken, his head lolling sickeningly to one side. His eyes now glowed with the same pale blue witch-fire as the king. He held a broken spear. "Arni, it's me," Einar choked out. The thing that had been Arni thrust the spear. Einar twisted at the last second, the rusted tip grazing his ribs. He kicked the drowned sailor away, ripped his sword free, and swung at his old friend. "I'm sorry, brother," Einar whispered as his blade took Arn's head off completely. The head rolled into the mud. The body collapsed. But for every Draugr they cut down, 3 more stepped out of the fog. They were crawling out of the mud, pulling themselves up by the anchor chain, climbing over the gunwales of the ship. On the deck, Thorstein and Bjorn were fighting for their lives. A skeletal warrior had climbed the rudder and was hacking at the mast. Bjorn stabbed it with his short sword, but the blade glanced off its ribs. Thorstein smashed a lantern over its head, setting its dry, preserved flesh on fire. The creature shrieked, a high, piercing sound that made Bjorn's ears ring, and fell back into the mud, burning. "We can't hold them," Leif shouted, firing his last arrow. "There are too many." Einar looked around. Half his men were dead. The survivors were exhausted, bleeding, and terrified. The shield wall was crumbling. They were being pushed back against the hull of the ship. "Get on the ship," Einar ordered. "Retreat to the deck. Pull up the ladders." The Vikings scrambled up the sides of the Sea Wolf. They pulled their wounded comrades up by their belts. They kicked the clawing hands of the dead away. As the last man tumbled onto the deck, they kicked the boarding ramps away. They were now isolated on the ship, a fortress of wood in a sea of death. For a moment, the attack stopped. The Draugr gathered around the ship, hundreds of them, staring up with their glowing blue eyes. They stood silently in the mud, waiting. "Why did they stop?" Bjorn whispered, wiping blood from his face. "Because he is here," Thorstein said, his voice trembling. The crowd of the dead parted. King Hrolf walked through the ranks of his army. He did not shamble. He strode with the arrogance of a conqueror. He carried his great sword, the green runes pulsing in rhythm with his footsteps. He stopped at the bow of the ship, looking up at Einar. The king raised his sword. He pointed it at Einar. "Come down." The voice in their heads was louder now. It felt like a physical weight pressing on their skulls. "Come down and join your kin." "I will not," Einar shouted back, leaning over the rail. "I am a Jarl of Kattegat. I do not bow to corpses." Hrolf laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound, like wind blowing through dry leaves. "Then I will bring the ship down." The king slammed the pommel of his greatsword into the hull of the ship. Boom! The wood cracked. He hit it again. Boom! A plank shattered. He hit it again. Boom! The ship shuddered violently, knocking men off their feet. "He's breaking the keel," Thorstein realized. "If he snaps the spine of the ship, it will split in 2. We have to stop him. We have no arrows left." Leif cried. Einar looked at his men. They were broken. They had no fight left in them. He looked at the treasure they had left in the tomb. He looked at the gold medallion still hanging around his own neck, the only piece of treasure he had managed to keep. "It's the gold!" Einar whispered. "He wants the gold." He ripped the medallion from his neck. He held it up so the king could see it. "Here," Einar shouted. "Take it all." He threw the heavy gold medallion over the side. It landed in the mud at Hrolf's feet. The king looked at the gold. Then he looked back up at Einar. He smiled, revealing his filed teeth. Too late. Hrolf swung his sword. A wave of green energy erupted from the blade, slicing through the air. It struck the main mast of the ship. Crack! The massive wooden mast sheared in half. It toppled slowly, crashing down onto the deck, crushing 2 men instantly and smashing through the railing. The ship groaned. The hull began to tilt. Abandoned ship. Einar screamed. Einar screamed. The men jumped. They leaped from the dying vessel into the mud below, landing in the midst of the waiting army. The slaughter was absolute. Bjorn and Thorstein jumped from the stern, landing in a patch of soft mud away from the main fighting. They scrambled to their feet. "Run, boy," Thorstein hissed, grabbing Bjorn's arm. "Don't look back. Just run." They sprinted into the darkness, away from the screams of their dying friends, away from the flashing green light of the king's sword. They ran until their lungs burned. They ran until they reached the far side of the island, a desolate beach of black stones. They stopped, gasping for air, collapsing behind a large boulder. We left them, Bjorn sobbed, his body shaking uncontrollably. Jarl Einar, Leif, everyone. They are dead, Bjorn, Thorstein said, his face gray. They were dead the moment we set foot on this cursed rock. From the distance, the sounds of battle had faded. The screams had stopped. Now there was only silence. And then the footsteps began again. Plank, clank. They were not coming from the beach. Thorstein looked up. Out of the fog, walking along the shoreline, came King Hrolf. He was alone. His sword was dripping with fresh blood. He was not looking for the others. He was looking for them. How? Bjorn whispered. Thorstein looked at Bjorn's belt. There, tucked into a small leather pouch, was a single silver coin, a coin Bjorn had picked up in the tomb and forgotten about. You fool, Thorstein breathed. You took a piece. Bjorn looked at the coin in horror. He has the scent now. The king stopped 20 paces away. He looked at the old navigator and the young boy. He raised his sword. Mine. Thorstein looked at Bjorn. He saw the terror in the boy's eyes. He saw his sister's face. Run to the cliffs, Bjorn, Thorstein said quietly. There is a sea cave there. Hide until morning. When the sun rises, the fog will lift. Maybe a ship will see you. What about you? Bjorn asked, clutching his uncle's arm. Thorstein smiled. It was a sad, tired smile. He reached into his tunic and pulled out his iron hammer of Thor. I am going to buy you some time. No. Uncle, go, Thorstein shouted, shoving the boy away. Go now! Bjorn stumbled back, tears blinding him. He turned and ran toward the cliffs. Thorstein turned to face the monster of the north. He was an old man. He had no armor. He had only a small knife and his faith. The green light of the sword illuminated the old man's face. You are not a warrior, the king hissed. You are meat. Thorstein held up his iron amulet. I am a son of the storm, Thorstein said, his voice steady. And my gods are stronger than your greed. Hrolf laughed. He raised his greatsword for the killing blow. Thorstein didn't flinch. He didn't close his eyes. He looked the monster in the eye and spat. See you in hell, king. Bjorn did not see the blow that killed his uncle. He only heard it. It was a sound like a wet branch snapping in a storm, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the black sand. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Thorstein's last command burned in his mind like a brand. Run. So he ran. He scrambled up the jagged volcanic rocks of the cliff face, tearing his fingernails, shredding his tunic. The fog was thick, choking him with the smell of sulfur and death. Behind him, the rhythmic clank, clank, clank of the Draugr king's footsteps continued, slow and inevitable. The king was not running. The dead do not need to run. They have eternity to catch their prey. Bjorn reached a narrow fissure in the rock, a small cave barely large enough for a fox, let alone a man. He squeezed inside, pressing his back against the cold, damp stone. He pulled his knees to his chest and covered his mouth with both hands to stifle the sound of his own terrified breathing. Below him, on the beach, the massacre was finished. The screams of the crew had been replaced by a terrible, wet silence. The only sound was the waves lapping against the shore, and the footsteps. They were getting closer. Bjorn peeked through a crack in the rock. Through the swirling mist, he saw shapes moving, not just King Hrolf, but others. The crew of the sea. The crew of the sea. His friends. They were walking again, and at the front of the pack, leading them like a hunting dog, was Jarl Einar. Einar looked horrific. His skull was caved in on one side, where the king had crushed him. His jaw hung loose, but he was moving. He sniffed the air, turning his ruined head from side to side. He is here! Please, he prayed to Thor, to Odin, to any god who was listening. Make me invisible. Make me stone. The footsteps stopped directly below his hiding place. Come out, little bear, Einar's voice whispered. The gold is warm. The king is generous. Join us. Bjorn bit his hand until he tasted blood. He didn't move. Then a massive shadow fell over the crack in the rock. King Hrolf was standing there. He was so close that Bjorn could smell the dust of the grave on his armor. The king raised his green, glowing greatsword. He didn't need to see the boy. He could sense the beating of his heart. He thrust the blade into the fissure. Bjorn scrambled back as the steel tip scraped against his ribs, slicing through his tunic and drawing a line of fire across his skin. He kicked out, his boot connecting with the flat of the blade. He pushed himself deeper into the hole, into a narrow chimney of rock that led upward. He climbed. He climbed blindly in the dark, scraping the skin off his elbows and knees. Below him he heard the king roaring in frustration, the sound shaking the cliff. He heard the scrabbling of claws as the undead Einar tried to follow him up the chute. Bjorn emerged onto a high ledge, 50 feet above the beach. The wind whipped his hair. He was trapped. Behind him was a sheer drop to the ocean. In front of him, the cliff face he had just climbed. And emerging from the hole, pulling himself up with unnatural strength, was the thing that used to be Jarl Einar. Einar grinned, his dead eyes locking onto Bjorn. "Found you." The undead Jarl lunged. Bjorn had no weapon. He had dropped his sword miles back. He had only a jagged rock he had picked up from the ledge. As Einar grabbed him, Bjorn slammed the rock into the Jarl's face. Dead bone crunched. Einar didn't flinch. His cold hands closed around Bjorn's throat, squeezing the life out of him. Bjorn kicked and struggled, his vision going black. "Die!" Einar hissed. "Die and serve!" Bjorn looked past the monster's shoulder. He looked at the horizon. And there, breaking through the wall of gray clouds, was a single thin line of crimson light. Dawn. The sun crested the horizon. The first ray of morning light hit the cliff face. It struck Einar's back. The effect was instantaneous. The undead Jarl shrieked, a sound of pure agony. Where the sunlight touched him, his preserved skin began to smoke. It blistered and blackened, turning to ash in seconds. Einar let go of Bjorn's throat, clawing at his own burning flesh. He stumbled back, blinded by the light. He fell. Einar tumbled off the ledge, falling 50 feet down to the rocks below, his body disintegrating into dust before he even hit the ground. Bjorn gasped for air, coughing, his throat bruised and swollen. The army of the dead was retreating. The sunlight was their enemy. It burned away the magic that held them together. King Hrolf stood on the shore, shielding his eyes with his massive arm. He looked up at Bjorn one last time. His blue eyes were filled with a hatred that would last 1,000 years. "Leave." The king's voice echoed in Bjorn's head, weaker now. "But you are marked. The sea will never forget you." The king turned and walked back into the ocean, sinking beneath the waves to return to his cold, dark throne. The fog lifted. The sea turned from black to blue. The island of ash was silent once more. Bjorn sat on the ledge for a long time. He watched the sun rise higher. He was alone. 40 men had come to this island. One had left. Hours later, a trading ship from the Shetland spotted smoke rising from the island. They sent a boat ashore, expecting to find a shipwreck. Instead, they found a single boy sitting on a rock, shivering, his eyes wide and unblinking. They took him aboard. They asked him who he was. They asked him where his crew was. They asked him about the strange, empty mound in the center of the island. Bjorn didn't speak. He couldn't. He just pointed to the north, his hand trembling. The captain of the trading ship saw the marks on the boy's neck, fingerprints that looked like they had been burned into the skin by ice. He saw the way the boy flinched at the sound of metal scraping on wood. "Leave him be," the captain whispered to his crew. "He has seen the other side." They sailed away from the island of ash. They left the wrecked hull of the sea, wolf rotting on the sandbar. They left the gold where it lay, scattered in the mud. Bjorn eventually returned to Kattegat, but he did not go home. He did not become a warrior. He did not marry. He built a small hut on the highest peak of the mountains, as far from the sea as he could get. He lived there for 60 years. The villagers called him Bjorn the Mad. They said he talked to ghosts. They said he never slept when the fog rolled in from the fjord. Bjorn's eyes were milky with age, but his grip was still strong. "Write this down," Bjorn whispered, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "Tell them not to seek the island. Tell them the gold is bait. Tell them that King Hrolf is not a myth." The skald wrote it down, his hand shaking. "Is he dead?" The skald asked. "Is the king truly dead?" Bjorn smiled. It was the smile of a man who finally sees the end of a long, dark road. "The dead do not die, boy," Bjorn said. "They wait." Bjorn closed his eyes. His breathing stopped. In the darkness, the skald heard a sound that made his blood freeze. It was not the wind. It was not the thunder, it was the sound of heavy iron, shod footsteps walking slowly up the mountain path toward the hut, and a voice, deep and cold as the bottom of the ocean, whispering from the shadows, "I have come for my coin."